Welcome. My name is David Hedrick, and I'm going to be presenting today on vertebrate pest management in landscape systems for their master gardeners. And what I'm going to do is break this up into 3 different videos where I'll be focusing on gophers, ground squirrels, and birds. First up, we've got gophers. These are a familiar critter in most yards, and what we need to do is go through and look at a little bit more detail and discuss some of the biology and what we can do in terms of management. Now, for gophers, there's actually quite a bit that we can do in the landscape setting for homeowners and others. And as we go through, you'll see that when we're talking about squirrels and birds eventually, that there's fewer and fewer options as we go on. All right, there are 5 species of gophers in California, and the one that we deal with here on the Central Coast is Boda's pocket gopher, and that is the one that is most widespread. Now, they are about 10 inches long, up to 10 inches long, and they grow pretty good here in terms of their size. 6 inches would be on the small side. So here's some images. We've got one that's above ground, and you can see here on the left that they've got the very distinct claws and very strong shoulders for digging. On the right, there's one that is come up out of its burrow and is shoving dirt that it has dug out of the tunnel and distributing that out to create a gopher mound. And you can see the very small ears, small eyes, good whiskers, and a very sensitive tail. So these guys are built for digging and an underground life. Now, this Boda's pocket gopher, Tomomys bota, is again the most common in our area, and it gets the name pocket gopher because it has fur-lined cheek pockets. Their fur on their body is adapted for them living in wet soil so that it doesn't cake up, and it insulates very well. Now, the front teeth protrude through a split in the lip, and the lip closes behind the teeth. So this is an adaptation to aid for digging, and that way they can use their teeth as well as their claws for digging through the soil, and they won't get soil in their mouth. Again, with the long whiskers there, that helps them navigate at night. It helps them navigate rapidly through the tunnels. And the tail is short and stubby and only has just a little bit of hair on it. And it is very sensitive, and it allows them to back up without having to turn around to see where they're going. That aids in getting into and out of a tunnel very rapidly. And if they're exposed like this one here that's feeding, if some predator comes along, they'll be able to back up very rapidly and escape predation. All right, here's some more information with regards to the pocket gopher and its identification. Both of these images show a gopher that has been caught, and it allows you to see the fur-lined cheek pocket. And it's basically an invagination of the skin to create a pocket. On the left, it's been pulled back. On the right, it's been basically opened up so that you can see what the pocket looks like. So it's just fur-lined cheek pocket. All right, and that's why they get the name pocket gopher. Now, on the right, you can also see how the teeth protrude through the split in the lip and do not, and the lip then closes back behind those teeth so that the mouth is protected from getting soil in it as they are digging through the terrain. Here's another image of somebody who had caught a gopher and has pulled open the cheeks to expose that they stuff food in those cheeks. And if you noticed a couple of slides back, that gopher that was exposed and out and feeding had its cheeks just chock full of what it was feeding on, the plants that it was feeding on. And so this is a clear indication that they use those cheek pockets to be out away from the tunnel, foraging around the gopher mound on any of this fresh green stuff that's available, and then they can take in a bunch of it, stuff it into the cheek pockets, and then move it back into the nest. So it's like their little grocery bags. Gophers tend to live about 3 years. They don't hibernate, and they're really active anytime. Now, they'll have 3 to 5 litters per year, with 2 to 10 young per litter. And we'll contrast that with ground squirrels. Ground squirrels only have 1 litter per year. Now, the gestation obviously would have to be short if you're going to have 3 to 5 litters per year, and indeed it is only about 18 days, and they're weaned in about 5 to 8 weeks. Now, gophers are very territorial, and moms don't want the kids around, so as soon as they are weaned, they are driving their young off, and they have to begin dispersal, which means that they are exposed. So they're out, and this is typically at night, running basically away from mom and trying to find a burrow of their own or dig a new burrow of their own. And they'll move anywhere from 300 to 400 feet away from their burrow that they were born in. Now, for the most part, they are nocturnal grazers, but if you've ever been out and about here on the Central Coast and have seen gopher mounds, you know that you can see them active during the day. So it's not that they are totally inactive during the day. They are digging and doing other things and doing some moderate close by feeding. And at night, they'll be out farther away and trying to forage under the cover of darkness. All right, so some of the burrows are common, meaning that if it's an intensely populated area full of gophers, some of the tunnels will meet up. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are living together. They're not colonial. They're still very independent and very territorial, but they may use a tunnel. Several individuals may use a single tunnel that connects a variety of different gophers together. And the one thing that is crucial to understand is that reoccupancy is rapid. So there may be a network of tunnels out there, and let's say that you've gone to the trouble of eradicating a gopher or two from an area. Well, you might turn around and start seeing activity again right in the area that you just took gophers out. And you're thinking, how did that happen? Well, it's because of this interconnectedness of the tunnels and the fact that, maybe in the springtime, especially when the young are looking for a new place, they will find and reuse old gopher tunnels. And so what we see is reoccupancy is rapid, within minutes to hours. Again, they're solitary, at least for a part of their burrow. And there is a nest and a food cache, a latrine, water sumps that drain water away from the nest and the food cache. So again, very territorial by nature. And if they are put together, let's say they're put together in a cage or in a bucket, they will fight with each other, fight to the death. And the only time that they're together is during breeding. Here's some fun field facts. Gophers are the #1 tunnel maker of North American rodents, simply because they can tunnel so much. Tunnels up to 800 feet long. Some studies show that there's sites that have 6,000 and up to 23,000 mounds per acre. Here's an example. So they can dig 3 to 4 feet in an hour in hard ground, and that would be a lot like the heavy clay that we have here in San Luis Obispo. They can still get through 3 to 4 feet. And one gopher can create several mounds in a day. Now, as I said, that they are territorial, and a male can have a territory up to 2,200 square feet. A female's would be about half of that. And territory sizes decrease as populations increase. So if you're thinking about 2,200 square feet, that's a good-sized single-family home. Uh, and then as uh, numbers increase and competition increases, that's gonna be smaller and smaller. Now there can be anywhere from 1 to 200 gophers per acre, but usually it ranges from about 16 to 20. And on the right here you can see a diagram of a map. And I think the important thing to take away from this map is that the gopher tunnels are kind of lateral in the way that they are built. So they do go in a line. And that's something to keep in mind, especially as you're looking at an area where you might have some gopher activity and you're trying to determine how many gophers you might have. And if you can see that there is an area of like a line of a line of mounds that you can see on the surface, and then there's a separation of 3, 4, 5 yards, and then there's another set of mounds, then that indicates it's likely two different gophers that are working. But you can see a gopher that is been in an area for a while can really create a very long burrow with lots and lots of mounds. Let's look at the damage that they do. Now, they are, again, underground, but they do feed above ground. So we need to take into account that we're going to have above ground damage and then below ground, and that's going to be harder to see. So they'll be feeding on any kind of woody, bulbous, or annual plants. They will be attacking new root stocks, and so that's where the problems come in. We also see that they will be feeding on underground utility cables and irrigation, especially drip tape. So they're no stranger to gnawing through that. Here's some examples of the mounds. In both of these, you can see a linearity to how the mounds are formed. And one on the left there is along a roadside, and you can see it's a straight line, but you get these offshoots of a mound going off to the left and to the right, but basically in a line. Same thing on the right, with a little lateral there on the far right, and you can clearly see the fresh mounding activity in the foreground, where the soil is a little darker than the lighter colored soil next to it. So we get some active gopher activity going on there. Here's some more damage. This is something that is not uncommon. In the upper left is a zucchini plant, and I experienced this myself in my yard. And we've got a zucchini planted, looking good one day. Next day, it's just all wilted, and you pull it up, and there's no roots left. And you look down, and there's a gopher tunnel. So they will take out these annual plants. On the right, they will work on the crown and the roots below ground. And then, of course, they are famous for tunneling in beds and pushing out all that excavated material and disrupting the landscape, as well as feeding on the plants. So let's take a look at the gopher mounds. Here we've got a gopher that's shoveling out his fresh excavation. And you can see the one on the right, we've got a crescent shape to the gopher mound, and that's an important consideration when you're trying to determine what kind of mounding activity you've got. The things that you would confuse it with around here, well, you wouldn't confuse it with a squirrel. We'll talk about that later, because the openings for a squirrel burrow remain open. They don't plug them. And with a mole, they don't throw out the excavated soil in a crescent shape like that. They'll have a little plug of soil, just creating one little mound of soil. Now, the burrow system can be complex. There are surface mounds and feeding burrows just for the one gopher, and those mounds will be plugged during inactivity or when they're nesting. And some of the burrow openings, like the one on the far right that leads up to the soil line, won't have a mound, and that'll be an escape tunnel. And you can see that the main tunnel for the gopher is about 6 or so inches below ground. So 6 to 12 inches below ground. And then it goes farther down for the nesting. So at the very bottom there would be the nesting, the latrine, the water sumps, and any food storage. So they will nest down farther into the soil profile than what they will do with regards to their feeding access. Now in hard soil, they won't be able to burrow very deep, but they have been known to tunnel downwards up to 6 feet or more. So you've got what you see on the surface, but then there's a lot more that's going on farther down below. As I said, the tunnels are plugged when inactive, and that's something that you see in this image here. And the darker the soil means the fresher the activity. That's going to be something that comes into play when we talk about trapping. Here's a great image of a gopher mound. You can see the crescent shape of the soil that's been extracted and shoveled out. The plug in the center that the gopher then uses to create a blockage for that tunnel opening so that nothing can get in. And the arrows on the right show how the soil has been shoved forward, and that gives you the indication of which way the burrow goes. And that would be the single arrow that's pointed downward. So the burrow comes up, and at an angle, they have an opening at the soil level, and then they shove all of the soil then forward away from the tunnel that's behind them. Some other diagrams here. This is showing the difference between a pocket gopher and a mole. And you can see again with the pocket gopher that plug with the crescent shape hill. The cutaway below will show you that you've got that lateral or feeding tunnel that's plugged with dirt about 6 inches below ground. And then on the right, what we see would be a mole, and a mole tunnels much closer to the surface, and so you get kind of a raised ridge there with the broken soil to indicate that a mole has been through there. And then they will have a push-up that will create basically a conical shaped mound. And it will be plugged, but the plug won't be visible or sunken in like it is with a gopher. Now, moles are meat eaters, and so they're generally considered not pests because they're feeding on worms, grubs, other insects, things that are bad in terms of damage to plants or turf. The issue comes into play if you're concerned about your turf. Their tunneling causes problems. It disrupts the turf grass, and then you've got these tunnels that collapse, and you end up with these trenches. And so in some places they are a problem, but in others they're feeding, especially on grubs and other insects, is a benefit. Now, the mole is obviously a very different looking creature. Small eyes that barely work, black fur, and those enormous front feet that are heavily clawed that they use for digging. Now, there's also voles or meadow mice, and they're a burrower too, but not as extensive as gophers or moles. And they can cause similar damage to above ground plants as we see with gophers. But voles don't have this deep burrowing system, and so what you see is this kind of very shallow trenching that takes place. And we do have voles here. I have seen them mainly in our natural settings along trails and so forth, but very rarely in the landscape. We do see them in agricultural settings for sure. So we do have moles and we've got gophers, and out of that, gophers are the primary ones. So identification should be relatively easy in making sure that you've got a gopher. In terms of management, the legal status is referred to as non-game. So what that means is there's no restrictions on its take, there's no seasonality, there's no permitting required. So it's a non-game mammal. And that means that you can use a variety of different tools against it, as long as those tools are legal within city limits or any other sort of limitations that you might have in a municipality or a reserve. So, for example, you cannot discharge a firearm in your backyard to kill a gopher because that's illegal within city limits. All right. So, I have here a list of management tactics, and I have them categorized as to whether they are more effective at high population densities or low population densities. So I've got exclusion that can work for both high and low population densities, toxic baits that work best when the populations are out of control, fumigants, not really effective, and we'll talk about that. There's miscellaneous types of management that I will talk about, and then predators. Predators usually have their best effect when the populations are low. And then with trapping, that also has its best effect when the populations are low because it's labor intensive. Sometimes you can set out a lot of traps when the numbers are high if the conditions really warrant that trapping is the best way to go. Okay, what we want to do now is talk about these different ones with some specifics. Exclusion, what you can have is above ground barriers that will slow the invasion. Now, this is a fence that's been set up with a sheeting over it that should stop most gophers from getting over and moving into an area. They can climb over it. A motivated gopher is, got the ability to do that, but they're not really built for climbing, and so it does serve as a pretty effective barrier. It's unsightly, but if you have some property that you're really wanting to protect against gopher invasion, you must consider at least some above ground exclusion as well as below ground exclusion. And below ground means trenches. And trenches, if they can be dug, are a very effective and safe way to keep gophers out. But the trench needs to be dug at least 2 feet below grade and then filled with some sort of material, perhaps aggregate, that will serve as a block that will make it so that the gopher can't get through. You can also put in some sort of hardware mesh, but you're going to have a very small opening on that mesh so that the gopher won't get through. And if you use something like chicken wire or aviary wire, eventually that's going to rust through and degrade, and it won't be a very effective barrier at that point at all. So you need to be thoughtful about trenching, and then what you're going to fill that with in order to slow the spread. When we think of exclusion, a lot of times what comes to mind is protecting individual plants as opposed to a large area. And with individual plants, then what this typically refers to is some sort of a basket, a wire basket with either aviary wire or kind of a fine hardware mesh like you see here. And as you're digging the hole, you need to take into account, if you're going to be using a mesh to protect a new planting, that you do need to have this deep. It's got to have a nice deep hole, and that you're going to put the mesh in and then fill and then plant, and make sure that you're going to have the mesh extending above grade as well in order to fully protect that tree or shrub, whatever it is that you're planting, until it gets well established. Now, the hardware mesh that you see here is a really fine mesh, and obviously Gopher's not going to get through that. But there's always the discussion about the roots growing out and then kind of getting girdled. And I find that aviary wire does the job, especially if you can dig a nice big hole to exclude the gopher far away from that root ball. And it allows the roots to establish and grow for a good long time. And then in the meantime, that aviary wire will eventually rust and break down. And it's kind of a better timing in terms of protecting the plant when it's getting established and then basically going away later on when it's beyond any sort of problems from the gopher. Now with raised beds, it's really straightforward. You can, if you're going to put a raised bed down on the soil, or there's going to be soil access to underneath the bed, then you can just layer in some of this hardware mesh before adding in your soil. Okay, so now we've talked about exclusion. It's time to talk about toxicants. And there are a variety of them out there. And this one is the one that is the most effective, bar none. And it is a gopher probe, which is available for purchase. You can see it on the right there. Sometimes they come in different colors, orange or red. This one's green. And the box that is at the top there contains, it's a container, it's an opening that has a place to put pelletized poison baits. And for gophers, there is a poison bait that is laced with strychnine. And it is actually for sale over the counter. You can get it at hardware stores. And this is something that really truly does work well. You use the probe, the pointed end, to locate a gopher tunnel. And once you've pushed through and then found a soft spot, you're in the tunnel, you turn a little crank and it releases a few of these pelletized baits into the tunnel. The gopher is attracted to them because they have kind of a garlicky smell to them. It's attracted to them, feeds on them, and it's an acute poison. So it feeds on it and it dies. And I have used this to great success. And I have to tell you, it's a lifesaver sometimes. So if you can't do exclusion and trapping is either too expensive or impractical, and you're not opposed to using poisons, then this strychnine bait is a really good one to consider. There are other tunnel baits like zinc phosphide. That's this in this brand Tomcat. And I find that it is not as effective. The gophers may or may not take it. And the other issue, like if you were thinking about using it for moles, they don't necessarily, they're meat eaters, and so they're not going to pick up some grain-based bait and feed on it. So not the most effective. Now, fumigants, again, not very effective. You will find these giant destroyers at most retail outlets, and it will claim that it kills gophers, moles, woodchucks, rats, skunks, ground squirrels, the whole bit. I only use them with ground squirrels, and the reason that I don't use them for gophers is because the gopher is able to use soil to wall off any part of its tunnel and basically render the gas ineffective. It doesn't get to them. And so, and they can do that rapidly. As soon as they start to smell something that's not good, they'll just wall it off and then go to some other part of their burrow system and be untouched by the fumigants. So fumigants for gophers, not effective. Here is another laundry list of ineffective things. So repellents like coyote pea and garlic oil, they do not work. Absolutely just don't work. There's sonic devices out there. Apparently there's something you can stick in the ground and it makes some sort of a noise that will drive gophers insane. So it doesn't kill them. Now you have an insane gopher in your yard. There's corncob baits. I've not seen these available on store shelves in a long time, but apparently something that they would feed on, and it would lead to dehydration. And then, of course, there's all of the wonderful YouTube videos of flooding them with a hose or sticking up a hose to your car exhaust and running that down. These gopher tunnels are built so that they can handle at least some flooding. You may get a gopher you may flood out a gopher if you're using a hose, garden hose, but again, you're going to get reoccupancy and you've got a gopher running around. It's just going to go find another hole to dig in. So you don't really get population control. And with the car exhaust, obviously they will just wall that off and it'll be useless. So those don't work. Now with burrow destruction, fun but impractical. And so when I'm thinking about burrow destruction, I'm referring to the Rodinator. You may have heard this is a device that floods the burrows with a mixture of oxygen and propane and then ignites it. And it works well in destroying the burrows. And if you're in an ag setting, big open field setting, it is a very effective tool for blowing up the burrows and killing the gophers in the process. But again, in a residential setting, basically impossible, if not illegal. All right, now onto predators. And again, these guys are good at low population densities. They keep the populations low. So if you've worked hard to rid an area of gophers, then your predators will keep it that way. And that would include snakes, bobcats, coyotes, owls, other raptors, herons, egrets, and even cats. So not all cats. Definitely not all cats. Some cats, yes. So the question then becomes, how many of these predators do you want in your yard or in a residential setting? Probably be okay with the owls because they're at night and you don't see them. Snakes? Probably not so much. Neither the bobcats. Herons and egrets usually aren't running around in neighborhoods, and so you're really limited here to cats and owls. All right, that brings us to trapping, and this is going to be the most intense section with regards to the options and what it takes to do trapping. So let's take it one step at a time. So trapping gophers is usually something that's done on a relatively small scale, yard size. You get any bigger than that and you've got yourself quite a bit of work ahead of you. And what you're trying to do, of course, is reduce the populations by using traps. And the nice thing is when you trap an animal, you know you've got it. It's not something that has died in a burrow, but you're not really sure if it has or not. You can install barriers once you've trapped an area out to limit the invasion or the re-invasion. And you want to trap in adjacent areas and work with neighbors if the gophers are kind of, extensive in the tunneling. And so you want to work in an area, clean it out, trap in an adjacent area, and push it back as far as you can. And then, of course, scouting for new activity around the perimeters. And that's the beauty of working in one area and cleaning it out of gophers is now you've set up basically a perimeter that is easier to monitor. Walk around the perimeter and see if you see activity there. And, of course, the activity is new mounds. And if you've trapped in an area and if you think you've rid yourself of the gophers, then of course you're going to take a shovel and knock down the mounds. And that will make it much easier to see if you've got new mounding activity. So that is your monitoring technique, is to knock the mounds down and see if you've got new mounding in that area. Okay, so with trapping, as I said, focusing on one area at a time. Too many traps over a large area, that kind of creates confusion. You don't really know where you're at. Sometimes you can lose your traps. And you'll see in the video on trap setting, flagging or some kind of a stake would be appropriate for the trap, keeping it in place and making sure that you can relocate. Observing natural barriers is important too, working to or from a fence line or working to or from a sidewalk. That allows you to, move to an area and then again monitor that perimeter for any kind of reinvasion. You do want to trap at the freshest sites. You want to eliminate all the gophers in each trapping area before you move on to the next. And as I said, gophers do repopulate very quickly, so don't get disappointed. You've taken out a gopher or two, and all of a sudden you see another one is there. Well, there's still less than what you had before, so don't get discouraged. Go ahead and trap that one out. I can tell you from personal experience. I moved to a new house, as you know, with Maria, and in our yard we have very sandy soil, and we were getting overrun by gophers. And I have been working steadily on getting rid of them and using both traps and the strychnine, and cross my fingers and knock on wood and all that stuff. We've not had any intrusions for quite a while, so it is possible. Don't get discouraged. You have to just keep working at it. Here's some images of some nice fresh active mounds versus old stale mounds, and you want to go for those ones that are got the darkest, moistest soils. And again, here's the feeding activity, and that gopher, just those cheek pockets full of all that grasses and forage that he's been working on. And then there's a little video on the right that we took last year of a gopher that was obviously feeding during the day, coming out of that feeding hole, and you don't see a mound there, so it's just kind of working that feeding hole, and it's coming out feeding and goes right back. And see how quickly they're able to go back, come out, feed a little bit, and its cheek pockets are just stuffed full, and then whoop, back in.
This is a great video of how they forage.
Very fun. Okay, now the idea is to set your traps early in the morning or late in the afternoon. Check them often. And if you are in an area, or if you found a mound that is active, don't walk away too far, because if you set a trap and you set it appropriately, those gophers are going to be right there. And they're going to get curious, and they're going to try and check and see what's going on. And you may get them literally within just minutes. You'll definitely want to wear gloves handling traps, especially ones that have been used before. You're going to want to wear gloves handling any of the dead gophers. And again, collapse those mounds so you can monitor for new activity. So here's the trap types. I'll be going over a video to show you how to set these, and that'll be a separate link. And the one on the left is the cinch. The one on the upper right is the black box, and then the green one in the middle is a Maccabee, and then there's the gopher getter, and they both work on the same principle. So these are the three main trap types for gophers. This is the black box. It's been set perfectly. A little bit of excavation has had to take place in order to get that box down and have the opening align with the tunnel. On the right, that is a gopher that has been snagged by one of those gopher getters, and they go straight into the tunnel, but there is quite a bit of excavating that has to take place in order for that to work. And so each of these traps have advantages and disadvantages. So we've got the box trap, the cinch trap, the Maccabee, and then the gopher hawk. I didn't put in an image of a gopher hawk. It's a pretty gnarly looking contraption. So we've got for the box trap, the black box, easy to set. There's minimal digging, and a benefit is there's no contact with the carcass. It's designed with the gopher biology in mind, which I'll talk about in the video. And we don't really have any non-target concerns there because there's really no way for dogs or cats or anything else to get in there and get caught in that trap. The cons are that the gophers can backfill those, and they oftentimes do. So you need to come in and move it and relocate it to a new mound. They're also expensive, but very long lasting. Now the cinch trap is a real beast. Again, minimal digging. You just slip that down into an open tunnel, and from where the mound is, they're very easy to see, so you don't lose track of them. There's no contact with the carcass, and again, designed with the gopher biology in mind. They're a bit challenging to set, and there are non-target concerns because it is wide open, and a nosy dog can get in there and get itself pinched. Moderate cost, about $15. The Maccabees, they're the old tried and true, easy to set. They are buried, and so there's no non-target concerns, but the burying is a problem. They're inexpensive and long-lasting, but you do have to dig, and it requires 2 traps to work. And so, and the small size is actually kind of a problem. They don't work well in larger tunnels. The gopher can just crawl right over them. And when you're dealing with these, you've got full contact with the carcass. Now, the gopher hawk is a probe that goes into the tunnel from the ground. You just stab it into the tunnel and is deployed that way. It has a very strong spring, and what happens is the gopher goes through a wire that is in the tunnel, and it trips the release mechanism, and the gopher basically just gets mutilated. So it's easy to know when you've got a gopher trapped, and there is no digging, but this has a lot of drawbacks. It's very difficult to extract the carcass. You have full contact with the mutilated carcass. They're very expensive, and they don't last. And if you use the black box and it has been deployed effectively, you get this, a job well done.